Today's exposition comes from Ephesians chapter 2, verse 10, which reads, "For we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them." So in the previous two verses, Paul had told the Ephesians that they were saved by grace through faith and not of works. And you could understand somebody asking the question, well then, where do good works come in? Surely we're supposed to do good works, aren't we? And that's where verse 10 comes in. We are not saved by good works. You could say we are saved unto good works. Good works do not result in our salvation. Good works are the result of our salvation. Per James, you could say that good works show faith. So unlike those who profess to know God, yet with their works deny him, Titus chapter 1, verse 16, for the believer, good works are the expected outflow of saving faith. Now we look at the language that Paul uses here in verse 10. He begins it by saying, "For we are his workmanship." Now, it's interesting because in the Greek, the pronoun is right at the beginning of the sentence and it has the feel of his workmanship we are. And that word for workmanship is the Greek word poiema. Now, it's used one other time in the New Testament, Romans chapter 1, verse 20, speaking of the things that God has made. And that's the idea of the word. It could speak to handiwork, something constructed, something made. It could even refer to a work of art. And a believer is God's workmanship. It further speaks of God's grace. But notice how this workmanship comes about. We are God's workmanship created in Christ Jesus. So we are created, and you could say recreated through union with Jesus Christ and as a result of the work of Christ. So believers are new creations in Christ, 2 Corinthians 5:17, as a result of the work of Jesus Christ on the cross and his victorious resurrection. And we are then, by the grace of God, being renewed in the image of our Creator and being conformed to the image of God's Son. We are God's workmanship, created in Christ Jesus. And then Paul goes on to tell us a primary purpose for this recreation that has happened in our lives. He says, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them. So a primary purpose for our salvation, not the only purpose, but a primary one, is that we would walk in the good works that God prepared beforehand for us to do. Now, Paul communicated this idea a couple of times in rather strong terms in his epistle to Titus. In Titus 2:14, he said that Jesus gave himself for us that he might redeem us from every lawless deed and purify for himself his own special people, zealous for good works. And then in the last chapter, Titus chapter 3, verse 8, he says this, "This is a faithful saying, and these things I want you to affirm constantly, that those who have believed in God should be careful to maintain good works." So God has good works prepared for his people, and we should be zealous, Titus 2:14, and careful, Titus 3:8, to walk in those good works. And as we do, the hope is that God will be glorified, that he will be glorified through good works, Matthew 5:16, and glorified through good fruit, John 15:8. So let me exhort you today. A primary reason for which you are saved is that you, as God's workmanship, you are called to walk in the good works that God has prepared for you. So in the language of the writer of Hebrews, do not neglect to do good. And as you do, remember that you're not doing it alone, for it is God who is working in you, both to will and to do his good pleasure.